Hello, Enviro students. Today we are going to go over the lecture for Chapter 2. Chapter 2 looks at two economic setups and looks into environmental public policy. So we're going to look at environment, economics, and human health and kind of put all of those three things together. First thing we're going to look at is resources. So we defined what natural capital was in the last lecture, but just to review, it's goods and services provided by an ecosystem. So whenever we're looking at the environment or a specific ecosystem, whenever we look at the goods that we can derive out of it or the natural services or ecosystem services that exist within it, that is how we can put value or put a capital or a dollar sign on that ecosystem. So there's usually two types of resources that we can get from an ecosystem. Goods and resources are kind of interchangeable words, so I will usually use the word resources. Renewable resources or non-renewable resources are the two types of resources we generally get out of ecosystems. Renewable resources are ones that can be renewed. They are usually things that can be grown or cycled within an ecosystem. Great example, wood or food. There is some variation in renewable resources. I like to look at the example of oak versus bamboo. So if you're familiar, oak trees usually can take up from 100 to 300, 500 years to get really tall and large. So they are a renewable resource, but they aren't the fastest growing renewable resource, especially when you look at it in the span of a human lifetime. Bamboo, on the other hand, can grow 3 feet in the span of a day. So when you're comparing renewable resources, some are faster at renewing themselves than others. So usually the ones that are faster at renewing are the ones that are better to make products out of, especially when you have large growing populations. So those are usually the ones that are considered more sustainable. So a lot of people that are choosing to buy bamboo are seen as more eco-friendly because they are using a resource that is able to renew itself much faster than something like oak. Non-renewable resources are ones that can generally only be used once. We say that they're only used once because they can go through a chemical change. So a great example of this is fossil fuels, say like oil. When you put gasoline into your car, it goes through a combustion reaction. So the hydrocarbons that you put in your car are not the same thing that come out of your car. You're going to have carbon dioxide, water, and other various air pollutants come out of your tailpipe. So that's a complete change in the chemical structure. That's something that we can't take and put back either. So once that happens, that resource is gone. They're also limited or finite in quantity. So the two main examples, fossil fuels. The other type of non-renewable resource are mineral deposits. There's only so much gold on the earth. So when you have that finite number, you can't create more of it. And this brings us to the concept of the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a situation in which an individual will act in their own self-interest instead of the good of the community, leading to depletion of natural resources. We're going to watch a TED Talk on what happens in that situation.
Imagine as a thought experiment that you live in a small village and depend on the local fish pond for food. You share the pond with 3 other villagers. The pond starts off with a dozen fish, and the fish reproduce. For every 2 fish, there will be 1 baby added each night. So, in order to maximize your supply of food, how many fish should you catch each day? Take a moment to think about it. Assume baby fish grow to full size immediately, and that the pond begins at full capacity, and ignore factors like the sex of the fish you catch. The answer? 1. And it's not just you. The best way to maximize every villager's food supply is for each fisherman to take just 1 fish each day. Here's how the math works. If each villager takes 1 fish, there will be 8 fish left overnight. Each pair of fish produces 1 baby, and the next day the pond will be fully restocked with 12 fish. If anyone takes more than 1, the number of reproductive pairs drops, and the population won't be able to bounce back. Eventually, the fish in the lake will be gone, leaving all 4 villagers to starve. This fish pond is just one example of a classic problem called the tragedy of the commons. The phenomenon was first described in a pamphlet by economist William Forster Lloyd in 1833 in a discussion of the overgrazing of cattle on village common areas. More than 100 years later, ecologist Garrett Hardin revived the concept to describe what happens when many individuals all share a limited resource, like grazing land, fishing areas, living space, even clean air. Hardin argued that these situations pit short-term self-interest against the common good, and they end badly for everyone, resulting in overgrazing, overfishing, overpopulation, pollution, and other social and environmental problems. The key feature of a tragedy of the commons is that it provides an opportunity for an individual to benefit him or herself while spreading out any negative effects across the larger population. To see what that means, let's revisit our fish pond. Each individual fisherman is motivated to take as many fish as he can for himself. Meanwhile, any decline in fish production is shared by the entire village. Anxious to avoid losing out to his neighbors, a fisherman will conclude that it's in his best interest to take an extra fish, or 2, or 3. Unfortunately, this is the same conclusion reached by the other fishermen, and that's the tragedy. Optimizing for the self in the short term isn't optimal for anyone in the long term. That's a simplified example, but the tragedy of the commons plays out in the more complex systems of real life, too. The overuse of antibiotics has led to short-term gains in livestock production and in treating common illnesses. But it's also resulted in the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which threaten the entire population. A coal-fired power plant produces cheap electricity for its customers and profits for its owners. These local benefits are helpful in the short term, but pollution from mining and burning coal is spread across the entire atmosphere and sticks around for thousands of years. There are other examples too: littering, water shortages, deforestation, traffic jams, even the purchase of bottled water. But human civilization has proven it's capable of doing something remarkable. We form social contracts, we make communal agreements, we elect governments, and we pass laws. All this to save our collective selves from our own individual impulses. It isn't easy, and we certainly don't get it right nearly all the time. But humans, at our best, have shown that we can solve these problems, and we can continue to do so if we remember Hardin's lesson. When the tragedy of the commons applies, what's good for all of us is good for each of us. TED is a nonprofit. If you value our work, please consider supporting it on patreon.com/TEDEd.
Okay, so let's review what tragedy of the commons is. So first, a commons. A commons is a shared area or space. So a great example when we're talking about a shared area or space for you guys is the high school. The students, the staff, we all share that space together, and we all share within the resources of that space. Another commons, a great example, especially on a global scale, would be air. We all are reliant on air, not just us, but all the animals on Earth are reliant on oxygen. All of the plants on Earth are reliant on carbon dioxide, and then we get into fungi and bacteria, and I'm missing an animal or one of the kingdoms, but protistas also, they were reliant on air, and this exchange is so important. But when we talk about the commons and we talk about air pollution, that is toxifying that commons. So 3 major examples that you guys saw: overfishing, overgrazing, and deforestation. Some of the impacts that can come out of a tragedy of the commons are pollution, loss of land or water or even air quality, health issues that fall out of that pollution, or loss of water, air, or land quality, loss of species, poverty, and hunger. So these are all things that can come out of when somebody works in their own self-interest and doesn't think about all of the organisms that rely on a common space area or the resources within that common space or area. So we're going to look at the overfishing example. This just kind of gives you guys an animation view of what's happening with the industrialized fishing. So the first one you watched was just individual farmers. This one is going to show you guys commercial level fishing. All right, so you guys could see that throughout that, as commercial fishing has gone from just, single lines in the water to large nets that catch huge populations of fish. We're just going through those populations faster and faster. And there are restrictions on how much fish you can catch. We'll get into that when we start talking about regulations later on in the lecture. All right, so we're going to do just a quick review of the economic views. So you guys read the article on the triple bottom line. A bottom line economy is one that is focused on profits. It does believe that resources are scarce, but it doesn't believe that resources are necessarily finite. So finite means that they are limited. When we talk about triple bottom line, you don't just look at profits anymore. You also include the environmental and social aspects. And as you include those three, you kind of think of those as your three bases of your economy. You work with those to make yourself a more sustainable company. So a lot of companies are taking on this triple bottom line. They don't necessarily put out all the information in a metric that combines all of these things. It's very difficult to combine your economic factors, your social factors, and your environmental factors. So a lot of the times they will do it in specific output numbers. So economics, you'll see those come out in profits. Social aspects, usually they'll, tell you the various diversity that they have within their company, diversity training, trying to bring minority populations up into higher levels within the company. You have them measuring environmental aspects, so like reducing waste, reducing emissions. It might be something where they're converting from non-renewable energy to renewable energy. So those are all ways you can compute your triple bottom line. But again, it's very difficult to take those three aspects and put it into one simple matrix or one simple metric that you can measure. In the triple bottom line economy, resources are also seen as scarce, just like in a bottom line economy, but it is recognized that they are becoming scarcer. The measurement of biocapacity is dropping, and that means humans have less and less natural resources to work with each year. And it's not just one natural resource, it's kind of across the board. A lot of our access is just declining, everywhere from fossil fuels to soil to our ability to produce food. Biocapacity is the amount of goods and services that an ecosystem can produce per person per year. And then resources can be finite within a human lifetime. So when we talk about various resources, we classify them, as I said in the beginning, as renewable and non-renewable. And really our gauge for that measurement is the human lifetime, which kind of right now is averaged around 80 years, but over time that number will probably increase. But a great example of a non-renewable resource, because of just how long it takes to make, is soil. Soil can take 1,000 years to create an inch. So if you lose an inch of soil, that's 1,000 years that you've kind of just wasted. So that's why it's important to kind of have this classification of renewable and non-renewable resources. Okay, we're going to switch gears and talk about regulation. Environmental public policy is really to promote the idea of the common good. So we talked about the tragedy of the commons. When we put regulation in there, the goal is to promote for the commons or promote for everybody so that we all have these things in common, and we want everyone to have good, healthy access to everything. So the environmental policy has two goals. The first one is to prevent pollution or reduce existing pollution. And then the second goal is the regulation of natural resources. You can do regulation by passing laws. So you can do that on a local, state, or federal government. So all of those are involved, but we also have a lot of international regulations occurring. So this is even going above our federal government and going into treaties with countries across the world. In our country, we have two types of regulatory law. The most straightforward one is command and control. That's when you set a limit or a cap on a specific amount of pollution. So this can be like a specific emission. For example, you can say you can only put this much carbon dioxide out into the air. So you have our national ambient air quality standards. So for certain types of emissions, there is literally an amount set on how much can be emitted into the atmosphere. And if we go over that amount, usually that can result in a fine for whoever is doing the polluting. And then you have your market-based approach. So what happens here is you provide incentives for polluters to reduce the amount of pollution that they are putting out there. And they've done this through a couple of different programs. They have tax rebates, and then they also use cap and trade systems. Cap and trade has been actually very successful. That's when you have a maximum amount that can go into the atmosphere, and every single company is allowed a certain amount of emissions, which, as you can see, is not spelled right. There we go. Sulfur dioxide, they set a limit on how much can be totally released to the atmosphere, and then every company was allowed to have a certain amount of emissions. So several companies actually started putting in scrubbers into their smokestacks that took out carbon dioxide. When they did that, their emissions dropped, but they still had a certain amount of emissions that they could have put out in the atmosphere. So what did they do? Well, they sold those to other companies that did not have scrubbers in their towers. So they were able to actually make a profit in this cap and trade program. It's actually been one of the most successful in reducing air emissions. So you guys will read more about that later on in our textbook when we get into air pollution. Looking at ways how regulation can stop this tragedy of the commons from occurring. We're going to watch another quick TED Ed.
Fish are in trouble. The cod population off Canada's east coast collapsed in the 1990s. Intense recreational and commercial fishing has decimated Goliath grouper populations in South Florida, and most populations of tuna have plummeted by over 50%, with the southern Atlantic bluefin on the verge of extinction. Those are just a couple of many examples. Overfishing is happening all over the world. How did this happen? When some people think of fishing, they imagine relaxing in a boat and patiently reeling in the day's catch. But modern industrial fishing, the kind that stocks our grocery shelves, looks more like warfare. In fact, the technologies they employ were developed for war. Radar, sonar, helicopters, and spotter planes are all used to guide factory ships towards dwindling schools of fish. Long lines with hundreds of hooks or huge nets round up massive amounts of fish, along with other species like seabirds, turtles, and dolphins. and fish are hauled up onto giant boats, complete with onboard flash freezing and processing facilities. All of these technologies have enabled us to catch fish at greater depths and farther out at sea than ever before. And as the distance and depth of fishing have expanded, so has the variety of species we target. For example, the Patagonian toothfish neither sounds nor looks very appetizing, and fishermen ignored it until the late 1970s. Then it was rebranded and marketed to chefs in the US as Chilean sea bass, despite the animal actually being a type of cod. Soon it was popping up in markets all over the world and is now a delicacy. Unfortunately, these deep water fish don't reproduce until they're at least 10 years old, making them extremely vulnerable to overfishing when the young are caught before they've had a chance to spawn. Consumer tastes and prices can also have harmful effects. For example, shark fin soup is considered such a delicacy in China and Vietnam that the fin has become the most profitable part of the shark. This leads many fishermen to fill their boats with fins, leaving millions of dead sharks behind. The problems aren't unique to toothfish and sharks. Almost 31% of the world's fish populations are overfished, and another 58% are fished at the maximum sustainable level. Wild fish simply can't reproduce as fast as 7 billion people can eat them. Fishing also has impacts on broader ecosystems. Wild shrimp are typically caught by dragging nets the size of a football field along the ocean bottom, disrupting or destroying seafloor habitats. The catch is often as little as 5% shrimp. The rest is bycatch, unwanted animals that are thrown back dead. And coastal shrimp farming isn't much better. Mangroves are bulldozed to make room for shrimp farms, robbing coastal communities of storm protection and natural water filtration, and depriving fish of key nursery habitats. So what does it look like to give fish a break and let them recover? Protection can take many forms. In national waters, governments can set limits about how, when, where, and how much fishing occurs, with restrictions on certain boats and equipment. Harmful practices such as bottom trawling can be banned altogether, and we can establish marine reserves close to all fishing to help ecosystems restore themselves. There's also a role for consumer awareness and boycotts to reduce wasteful practices like shark finning and push fishing industries towards more sustainable practices. Past interventions have successfully helped depleted fish populations recover. There are many solutions. The best approach for each fishery must be considered based on science, respect for the local communities that rely on the ocean, and for fish as wild animals. And then the rules must be enforced. International collaboration is often needed too, because fish don't care about our borders. We need to end overfishing. Ecosystems, food security, jobs, economies, and coastal cultures all depend on it.
So when we look at the cost of being environmentally friendly, there's kind of a fear of being an environmentally friendly company or a sustainable company because there's a lot of thought that it's very costly. But in actuality, it comes with both benefits and consequences. So you guys can see the chart kind of lays them out. Your generation and my generation are really starting to favor eco-friendly companies, sustainable companies. So this trend towards sustainability is a growing one, and a lot of people are actually stop buying products from companies that are not deemed sustainable and will only buy from eco-friendly. So there's a trend happening, and it's a benefit if you have that for you because you will pull in a certain number of consumers, and the more that climate change has an impact on the earth, the more people are turning towards these types of companies. Costs are usually higher, but not as high as people fear. So in your textbook, I believe it says it's 1.7% higher to have these eco-friendly or pollution preventing technologies in place. So the overall cost, yes, is higher, but it is not a terribly high percentage. It is less than 2%. You have a healthier workforce when you are not dealing with very harsh chemicals. If you do truly invest in sustainable options, you can actually lower your overhead. So the total cost to operate. When you think about overhead, a lot of the times you think about energy costs, heating costs, how much it takes to make the product. If you switch over from using power from a utility and you generate your own power through, say, wind or solar or geothermal, then you're going to significantly lower the cost. There's a large initial investment, but once you have that in place over time, that will reduce your overhead. So that's one of the less known benefits of being a sustainable company, that eventually if you invest in technologies that are green, generally your overhead becomes lower over time. Consequences, there is usually a higher cost, but again, it's not so high of a cost to be environmentally friendly that you're going to sacrifice significant number of jobs or company worth. So again, that 2% that we talked about with the benefits, that's that higher cost. You might also have lower production. This comes with the whole idea of limited resources. If you dedicate yourself to being a sustainable company, then you have to operate within that growing period or sustainable period that is needed for populations to regenerate. So you may not be going all out for top production, top dollar, but your company's going to be around for a long time because you are maintaining your resources. Okay, these are some of the benefits of the green market or green jobs, sustainable jobs that are emerging. These were all mentioned in your book. Again, this is from 2010, but if you're interested in the field, some interesting numbers to look at. Cost benefit analysis is when a regulation is considered and various options to achieving that regulation based on cost is examined. So the regulators don't want to put extreme burden on polluters, so they try to find an effective method that's not too costly. But there's a problem with this because most of the time these costs are way overestimated. The example that you guys had in your book was eliminating CFCs from automobile air conditioners. So they said that the overall cost to reduce that from or eliminate that from the automobile air conditioners would be possibly up to a couple $1,000s. In actuality, it was, anywhere from $40 to less than $400. So there was a very large overestimation of cost. External costs, that is something when you have an event or an item that impacts a business and it's not included in the usual loss or profit calculations. So a lot of the environmental issues that occur have impacts on companies and they're not always able to calculate that. That's why triple bottom line is a better gauge to kind of figure out how companies are affected by the environment. So, I think one of the examples from your book was invasive species. I always think of a vine down in the south that's invaded kudzu. Kudzu is costing places like Atlanta, Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, millions of dollars a year because they're literally cutting it back all the time. It's a really invasive vine and they're spending lots of tax dollars trying to keep roads and buildings intact because the kudzu is just overtaking and causing structural issues. So that's an external cost that the government hasn't really thought of and it's taking a loss on it. That covers all of chapter 2. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.